Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 241. And this time I'm going to talk about Herbie Hancock's Blue Note album from 1964, Inventions and Dimensions. This is a 2019 reissue, remastered by Kevin Gray, which, typical of that particular combination, sounds pretty good. In terms of what to expect, well, you can never really pigeonhole Herbie. And in fact, he spent a whole career making sure that that's not possible. It's modal, it's also experimental. Most, if not all, of the album is improvised within the general chalk lines that he gave his sidemen. And if there's a word to describe this whole record, I basically call it interesting. It's very accessible, but it's also what you might call musician's music because it exists very much on the cerebral side of the ledger as opposed to the more visceral, swinging, grooving side. It's also a bit of an oddity as an album because it's the work of a quartet, two of whom are Latin percussionists, although it is not really Latin jazz. It's much more in the modal and post-bop lane. As such, it's a remarkable record, although it didn't attract that much attention back in the day, and it doesn't really make people's sort of best of Herbie lists typically, but there's really no good reason for that. This has something to offer both the serious music nerd and the casual music fan, and in recent years it's gained a fairly sizable number of followers, myself included. Herbie Hancock was born the same day as my mother in April 1940. Both of them are still going strong. My mom exercises regularly and occasionally takes a small glass of white wine. Herbie has been known to experiment a little more expansively. He was born in Chicago to a family that really valued academic attainment. He studied classical music as a kid, and he was quite a prodigy. By the age of 11 in 1952, he had already performed elements of a Mozart piano concerto with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Famously, in terms of jazz composition, he was influenced by Bill Evans, but also by the vocal group the Hi-Lo's, who were kind of an all-white male precursor to the Manhattan Transfer, probably doing them a disservice. Their music was mainstream pop, but they had quite advanced arrangements done by a guy called Claire Fisher, and if that interests you, I recommend you give a listen to their 50s compilation, Harmony in Jazz. Despite Herbie's talent, his parents were skeptical of a career in jazz not backstopped with anything more reliable, and so after high school, off he goes to Grinnell College in Iowa to study music and electrical engineering. In 1960, however, he gives up on Grinnell, heads back to Chicago to try and make his name as a jazz musician. In the early 1960s in Chicago, he plays with a whole bunch of well-known musicians, including Coleman Hawkins. But his big break happens when Donald Byrd, the trumpeter, arrives in Chicago, but a snowstorm has delayed his regular piano player. So Herbie sits in, and he stays with Byrd from 1960 until 1963, and their musical relationship would last for decades. Herbie moves to New York to play with Byrd, and his time with that group also includes time in the recording studio. He's on Out of This World and also Royal Flush, both of those albums coming out in 1961. In this period, he also appears on Freddie Hubbard's classic record from 1962, Hub Tones, and he also gets a chance to play with the avant-garde saxophonists Roland Kirk and Eric Dolphy. Moving in these circles in New York, it wasn't going to take too long before he caught the eye of Blue Note Records and Alfred Lyon, who signed him up to a record deal in 1962, and that year he also released his debut on Blue Note, Taken Off. From the very beginning of his time with Blue Note, his strengths as a composer became evident. He was supposed to show up with 3 originals and 3 standards for his first recording session, the one that produced Taken Off, but when Lyon heard his originals, he said, never mind the standards, just write me 3 more originals. And of course, Hancock goes on to be one of the more prolific jazz composers of the 1960s. When it came out, Taken Off was quite well received, especially the track Watermelon Man, which kind of verges into soul jazz or even R&B. That charted in the lower reaches of the jazz charts, but it did even better when the Cuban percussion star Mongo Santamaria does his own cover, and that gets up to number 10 in the Billboard Hot 100. It ended up becoming one of the most covered jazz tracks in the 1960s, and that fact paid, if not all, at least a big whack of Herbie's bills the rest of the decade. It also ends up cementing his reputation with his label, and he ends up putting out a total of, I think, 7 records for Blue Note. It also brings him to the attention of Miles Davis, who at that time was looking for a new quintet. Hancock had met Miles about a year before through Donald Byrd, and Tony Williams, the young drummer that Miles was bringing into his quintet, was also basically acting as a proxy recruiter, constantly asking Herbie when he was going to come and hang out with Miles. Eventually, Miles phones up Herbie and asks him to come for an audition, and he shows up along with Ron Carter and Tony Williams and George Coleman, who was a predecessor to Wayne Shorter in the second great quintet, but no Miles. And so they start rehearsing, and they rehearse actually for 3 days. Miles is popping in and out, he's saying hi, but he's never playing. And then eventually Miles says, okay, the recording date is next week. And Herbie goes, well, am I actually in the quintet? And Miles says, well, you're on the record, aren't you? And it turns out that Miles actually had been listening to him through the intercom for 3 days. which is just kind of weird, but there you go, he's the Prince of Darkness. Also during this period in 1963, Herbie's second record as a leader with Blue Note, My Point of View, comes out. It's notable for a few reasons, not least being one of the earliest appearances on record of Tony Williams, the future drummer for Miles Davis, who was only 17 at the time the record was made. Like Herbie's debut, My Point of View was pretty much straight ahead hard bop and soul jazz. It wasn't taking a ton of risks there, and it's not actually that remarkable a record, but one gets the sense, certainly from this record, which came soon after, that being invited by Miles to join what was basically one of the two hottest jazz groups in the world at that time probably gave Herbie enough confidence that he felt he could spread his wings and go into the studio in August 1963 to take some risks in making this record. This record's made on the 30th of August 1963 at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, and Alfred Lion is the producer. The lineup is kind of a fascinating one-off in that it's got a representative of Miles Davis past and a representative of Miles Davis present, plus two out-and-out Latin percussionists. Herbie, who is Miles' newest recruit, is of course on piano. On bass is Paul Chambers, who had been with Miles between 1955 and 1963 and had just left to form a trio with Wynton Kelly. What both of those players had in common, and a major reason why both of them were so prized by Miles and spent so long with Miles, is that while both of them are incredibly fluent in hard bop, they are also both classically trained and were able to move fairly fluidly through a wide variety of styles, which was great if you were playing with Miles because he was constantly on the move laterally, mentally, when it came to music. But what neither of them was a Latin jazz specialist, and both of the other players on here completely fit that bill. Willie Bobo is on drums and timbales. He is a Latin jazz legend. He's also a longtime associate of Mongo Santamaria, with whom he played with Tito Puente before both of them moved to Cal Tjader's Modern Mambo Quintet in the latter part of the 1950s. He would go on to be a big part of the whole salsa thing in the 1970s, and he's known for a whole variety of different genre-bending crossovers. The other percussionist on here is Osvaldo Chihuahua Martinez, who is on the congas, the bongos. He also plays the güiro, which is a kind of that thing that makes a washboardy, scratchy sound. He was a longtime collaborator of Mongo Santamaria's as well, and he spent a long time in Mongo's band after Mongo left Cal Tjader in the early 60s. Finally, just a word about this incredible cover. I haven't been able to figure out exactly where the photo was taken, but it was, of course, taken by Reed Miles, he of so many famous Blue Note covers. The first song in this record is Succotash, which is in 6/8 time. The Latin percussion section is the total star here. They're playing in a typical kind of experimental rhythm. Herbie's got this staccato, almost sort of robotic figure he's playing. Chambers is experimenting alongside, and the whole net effect is something like jazz craftwork. The other song on side one is Triangle, which is a fascinating tune. It starts out like a classic blues-based hard bop, except that the scales are not quite blues scales. And it tells you a little bit of something, at least it tells me anyway, how ingrained the blues is in my understanding of hard bop, because I found myself constantly anticipating notes which would seem to be the obvious next note to happen, except that note never arrives. Side 2 starts with Jackrabbit, which is a fantastic song. It's a very rapid rhythm with the cymbals very present. Chambers is playing this same kind of 5-note bass motif all the way through. But the high point for me is this break for this timbala solo by Willie Bobo, which, as the kids say, is lit. Then we have Mimosa, which is basically a ballad, but it has this slow, burning percussion element thanks to Martinez's hand drumming. It's a good track, although I felt it doesn't really go all the places it could given the length of it. The final song is Jump Ahead, and the device that Herbie is using here is basically handing the initiative to Chambers and saying, Paul, you play a particular note, and then for the next, whatever it is, I think 16 to 32 bars, I have to improvise based on that note, and then we repeat and you pick something different. It's a good track, but this is kind of what I mean when I say musician's music, because it's kind of hard to pick up on those nuances, accurate though they may be, in your first few listenings. This is an album brimming with the confidence of its leader. Herbie arrived with very little of the music written down, but what he did was challenge his sidemen, particularly Paul Chambers, to extemporize within some fairly quirky guidelines. That's tough enough to do without mixing genres, but he did that as well. Overall, this is, as I said at the outset, a really interesting record. It's a record which is rising higher and higher in people's estimations of Herbie's past work, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.